Right, to open the unit, I'm going to first remove the batteries. I need to remove these two covers. To open the cover, you can use pry tools. However, it is pretty tight. So I'm just going to use a flat screwdriver. I just cover it in a sheet. I put it here towards the back and I just press it in there. Once I'm in, I support that with my finger and now I can just wedge my screwdriver along the root. There's very limited damage from using the screwdriver. I do the same on this side. There are 5 Torx screws and one underneath here. These screws are Torx, but it's the tamper-resistant Torx, which means your Torx bit needs to have a hole in the middle. I'm using a T9, and I can just turn this by hand. You note the little pin in the middle of the Torx screw, and that goes in the little hole there. Now, if you haven't got a Torx screw, you can also use a flat screwdriver. I'll quickly demonstrate. This screwdriver is probably just over 2 millimeters in width, and I just wedge it there, and it does slip a little bit, but it is doing the job. There's a screw underneath here. You can use a blade and lift up this cover. Right, I can now remove this cover. I remove that, and I remove that. Right, you can remove this back cover. I need to pop out these little motors. They are held in place by this little lip there, and lift that so that I can slide the motor out. If you want to, you can also just use your nail and then you can slide the motor out. Now I just need to lift up these antenna wires, and it's just 2 screws, 1, 2. These are Torx screws and I'm using a T6. I'm now going to separate the bottom board from the top board by just unplugging it. It's just a plug there, and I gently remove this. If this hasn't already fallen out, this is the audio jack, so just put this aside somewhere. Now it is still pretty taut, so now I can just release the wires on the side to give me some room to work with that bottom board. So I just need to release these wires. That's on one side and then the other side. I just pull them very gently. Now I've got space to work with this board. Right, this is the joystick that's giving a problem. There's a potentiometer on the side here and one over here, which is a variable resistor. Now using a replacement joystick, I'm now going to desolder the old one and place the new one in its place. You will need a soldering iron, but also a solder sucker to remove the old solder so that you can remove the joystick. Since quite a lot of force is going to be pressed on this board, I'm just putting something underneath here so I can press on the board and I won't damage all the items here. Now I am going to use the solder sucker, so I just press it in and it's spring loaded. When I heat up the solder, I can suck out the old solder. Another option is to get something like this. It's a copper strip and you hold it over the terminal, and what it does is it sucks out the solder. So you can also use this method. I hold the soldering iron on the terminal for about 3 seconds, and then I take the solder sucker and suck out what I can. And I keep doing that. Sometimes it will suck out the solder, sometimes it doesn't. You might need to repeat it. If you're having trouble sucking out the solder, sometimes it helps to actually put a little bit more solder, and then it comes out as one single piece. So over here, I'm actually going to add a little bit of solder, and then I'm going to suck it out. And there it actually did a much better job. That's what we're aiming for. You want to heat up the pin and then take the solder sucker and put it right on it straight away. And there's 2 over here. So using the replacement, I can see that I needed to desolder 3 points there, then another one there, 4 over here, 2 on this side, which is these 2 over here, and then 3 here, and then 2 over there. For the most part, I've sucked out most of the solder, but even though it is sucked out, I still need to heat it up while I lift it. So what I have to do is I have to wedge a screwdriver somewhere. It doesn't matter which side you choose. You could choose the other side, you could choose this side, whichever side you want. You just want to get the screwdriver in there, and then you're going to heat up as you go along, and hopefully you get it out. Now over here I've got this motor, and it is a little bit annoying, so I'm just going to desolder these wires so it just makes it easier for me to work. Right, so I'm just releasing this motor. You don't have to do that. I just don't really want little things on the board while I'm working. So if you wanted to, you could desolder these wires and then resolder them after the fact. On this side I've done that. I'm just showing you can do either way. It is a bit easier to work with a board without wires attached to it. All right, I have my screwdriver wedged here, and now I can heat this up and start turning my screwdriver, which is effectively lifting the joystick from the main board here. It's easier if you open these sides because then it doesn't hold the frame in. So there I'm just opening these to make it easier for me to remove this steel frame part. Notice how it is already lifting off the board. So I'm just going to put my screwdriver in a little bit deeper now. And as I press it in, I'm heating up these little joins here. I've felt it's definitely lifted. And wherever I'm soldering is where I'm using the screwdriver. Look at that. See, that has come out. Now it's just the back of these potentiometers. I just need to heat these up. And if you can, try to heat up 2 at the same time if your soldering iron bit is a bit fat. Right, that has been desoldered. Now, just a tip, while you're pulling this, don't wiggle it. If you wiggle it, you might push the pin back in and lift the track. So what I do is I pull in one direction only. So I'm pulling this way. I was pulling to the side, and now what's happened is it's a little bit lopsided. I'm now just going to pull like this. I'm not going to now lean it to the opposite side because it'll push this pin back in and lift the track, and that's going to be a nuisance. So I'll put my screwdriver in there and I get ready to turn it, which is going to lift the device off the board. You can also heat it up from this side because this is being soldered through the board. So it's a little bit more tricky. So I'm just going to heat it up from this side now, and there it came out nice and easily. Before soldering in the new one, I want to just inspect that all the tracks are okay, nothing's damaged. And I also want to make sure that none of these holes are blocked by solder. For example, one over there is blocked. So I'm going to just open this one hole here and that one over there. That one is now open. There's one over here. That one is open. And this last one over here. Right, I've managed to open all the holes except for these two. It's fine. I can still put the joystick in. I'll just solder as I go. So there is the replacement joystick. It's almost ready to be inserted. It's just these two here which are not open. So I'm going to heat them up and press the joystick in. All right, so I've just taken some tape just as a platform here. I'm wedging it. I don't want to damage the pin here. So I'm just using that and now I'm pressing it while I solder. It's just these two pins here which are stubborn, and I can also heat it up from underneath. All right, just having a quick check. Notice that I've soldered those directly. All the rest are just seating nicely. There's no problem. You might be able to see all the pins coming through there. It was just these two that I was having trouble with. So I'm just going to get them to be flush. I'm just checking here. It's not flush yet. Right, this one is now flush. Right. So make sure you flip it around to see that all the sides are flush. If it's not completely flush, what will happen is when you put the joystick on, then what will happen is it'll scratch here on this cover. So you've got to make sure that the replacement joystick is absolutely flush. A little trick to make each side flush, just put solder on one of the pins here. Right, so that pin has now been soldered. Now I want this to be flush. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press it down and just desolder the very thing I've soldered. And then I can feel, yes, it moved a little bit. Now I release it and I allow that to cool down. That is going to hold that side flush onto the board. Now I do the same there, the same there. So I just put a bit of solder on one of the pins. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat up that exact same pin, but I'm going to press this onto the board. I heat up the pin and now I press the joystick onto the board. I release it. It is cooling down, but it's cooling down with that pin being tightly pressed onto the board. Right, quickly inspect it. Is it flush? Yes. This side, is it flush? Absolutely. Right, now that everything is flush, I can just solder all the pins. There are some through-hole solder points here. Once it's had a few minutes to cool down, I just go over and check all the soldered joints. I just hold it on for 1 second per point, and then I move on. Now, one of the reasons why I go around and resolder it is because some of these pins are actually soldered to the top part of the board and the bottom. So you might notice like there, the solder hasn't come through. However, you can't hold the soldering iron on here for too long because you can actually damage the parts. You want to hold it long enough so that the solder can spread nicely, but not too long that you damage the parts. One trick would be to solder one leg and then leave it and move to a totally separate part of the joystick, and then you can come back because then the heat would have dissipated. All right, the audio jack has popped out. Notice the contacts are facing up. You want this to line up with that. So I'm plugging that into that. So notice I'm lining it up. I'm holding the headphone jack at the same time. I'm basically plugging in the top board into the bottom board, and the headphone jack is in place. Now I can return these vibrating motors and I slide it in there, and you'll notice that it gets stuck. Just flip it around. There's a lever there, and then once I push it back, it's just spring released. Then I can slide the motor in, and that lever holds the motor in place. So I just need to press this down, and then I can slide this motor in here. It also helps if you can just angle this while you are sliding it in. The red wire has come off, so I just need to put a dot of solder here on this point, and then I just have to solder the red wire back on here. Using my side cutters, I'm just removing a little bit of the jacket there, put a tiny bit of solder on the exposed wire, and just remove these other wires out of the way, and just solder that back on. Just return the antenna wires. You just place it over it, take your nail and press it down. You don't need to force. If it's not going in, then it's not aligned properly there. It clips in nicely, almost like a button press. Notice the orientation. This is just for the Bluetooth pairing. Return the Torx screws. One is there, one is there. Refeed your wires. If you're finding it's difficult to thread, just help it along with your screwdriver. Do not press hard. have a look at the wire run and notice the wire goes underneath that metallic strip. Notice that these antenna wires are sitting in these grooves here. That's because the battery is going to sit over here. Notice that these wires are towards this side and these wires are towards this side. Notice that the wires are nowhere near this lever. Make sure the top two screws are in place. Now these two metal strips are for the battery, and when I slide on the top cover, I make sure the strips come through on the inside. It should look like that. Give the joysticks a bit of a clean and return them. Return the top cover. Now before you put the screws in, you might want to go and test it, but in my case I know it's working. Return the 5 screws and seat the covers on by pressing it firmly in place. Alright, so it was the top left joystick. Here I'm moving it around and there it is good as new. Going back to its position perfectly, no drift. Thanks for watching and cheers.